so I have a feeling that the boundary couldn't have been that far north. And I've often wondered whether in fact it was Saltpan Creek, where Northbridge is now. Governor Phillip, when he turned up in 1788, estimated there were about 1,000 people living around the harbour. It was a surprise to him because he was led to believe there was no one here at all. And one of the reasons was that Joseph Banks, who was on board the Endeavour with Cook, of course, in 1770, said he saw no evidence of architecture and therefore assumed that there was hardly anyone living there and no one in the interior. And it was one of the reasons that he rather dismissed any tenure of the few people he did see in Botany Bay and then up at the Endeavour River in Queensland. They were the two groups they encountered. Of course, the Endeavour didn't come into Sydney Harbour. And he dismissed any tenure in the way that sort of a Lockean Englishman might, sort of Enlightenment era. But Aboriginal people, while they were living in overhangs and making use of what was there, were also building structures. And this is the only image I've seen of a structure in the North Sydney area. This one from a Russian expedition in 1820, showing a structure made of, well, clearly sticks, and that's possibly bark or leaves, casuarina leaves over the top. A description that was written at that time by the Russians suggested that these were temporary structures, and they were even built for events like childbirth. A woman would live separately in a shelter for a while until, having given birth, presumably with some people there to help her. The term that was used at the time is nomadic by the Europeans who were observing the first harbour people, and it implies that there's no sense of place or no defined territory. So it's a term I tend to avoid, particularly in the context of Sydney Harbour, because although the territories may have been quite large and the groups relatively small, possibly the Camaragal only had between 100 and 200 people, which would make sense because that's about the ideal grouping for a social group, so you don't have to enter into complex communication technologies, and you don't need money, and that dealing with all those methods of exchange with strangers that comes with far greater populations are not necessary when you know everyone in your group, or you're only one or two people removed from everyone in your group. So it works very well without all those other technologies. Anyway, they were mobile within their territories and going from one bay to another, chasing resources as when necessary in different seasons, because fish come and go in different seasons, or maybe you've exhausted the resources in a particular bay and you move on to the other one. It's better being on the western side of Ball's Head in the winter, where you're going to get the sun, than it is in summer, so they would have adapted accordingly. But it doesn't mean that they had no sense of place. Of course they did, and there would have been protocols attached to entering into someone else's territory. So the fact that we know at least the eastern and western boundaries of the Camaragal people means that was apparent to the people who wrote that down. It was the Aboriginal people had an oral culture, and much of what we know of them and the other harbour people come from the journals of particularly the officers of the First Fleet and the Second, Third Fleet and so forth, and expeditions like the Russian expedition. One of the men here, and I'm not sure which one, possibly the chap on the right, is Bungaree, who came from the Broken Bay area, further north, still sandstone country. But by the time he came down to Sydney in 1800, those original groupings, the Camaragal, the Gadigal on the south side, the Wongal, which is Bennelong's mob, they had essentially been broken up. Disease, particularly in 1789, had devastated the population, and dispossession and all sorts of calamities that befell them, violence, the introduction of alcohol, meant that those original groupings had dissipated, but people still got together in other groupings. So this was the group that had gathered around Bungaree on the north side. And my understanding is that this illustration was based on a scene at Kirribilli. It was one of their favourite places. He was given land at George's Head to farm, and he showed no interest in farming whatsoever. I mean, they just continued on fishing, knowing what they'd done for a long time. Well, Europeans turn up and have a very different attitude to the landscape. It's there as an economic resource. And that's an attitude that goes back into the Bible. I mean, God creates everything for the use of man, in inverted commas. It's all there to be used and subjugated. But also in Enlightenment terms, everything is there to be measured and quantified and turned into economic gain too, recorded. And within a decade, this is what the scene on the south side of the harbour looked like. You know, you've got a motley collection of huts, which was the rocks, and then around to the east side of Sydney Cove. So we're looking here from about Pitt Street across to the North Shore. And you might see a little arrow on that illustration, which I've inserted, that engraving, and that will show you where this is. This is extraordinary. One of the benefits of digital technology is it means you can really dig down into an engraving. And there is the first European hut built on the North Shore, around the spot of the pylon of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, as far as I can understand it. So that's Samuel Lightfoot's hut. He never bothered to hang out there too much and pushed off, and the land was then granted to Robert Ryan and then was contested by Robert Campbell, who was one of the first free merchants in the Cove, and James Milson, who was another one. I think Milson, well, Campbell won the legal fight, but Milson won the naming rights, because Milson's Point is named after him. What I find also interesting is the way that the forest comes almost all the way down to the harbour then. Aboriginal people almost certainly used fire, but they would have done so to clear the underbrush for ease of movement, not for fire stick farming. There's an assumption, particularly around at the moment, that everywhere was burnt and everywhere was turned into pasture for attracting kangaroos or whatever, which were then hunted. You know, that with the term fire stick farming has been around since the 1960s. And I just don't think that was the case anywhere around Sydney Harbour. Yes, the underbrush was burnt, but these people lived primarily off the bounty of the harbour itself, and that was noted by the people of the First Fleet. They said they live off seafood alone. Well, they probably didn't. They probably ate wallabies and possums as well. But certainly shellfish and finfish were a huge part of that. So there's a pretty thick forest. Probably a lot of that's Angophora, maybe stringy bark and scribbly gum. But it comes all the way down to the water, and the same would have been on the south side, which gives you an idea of how much timber was cleared within 10 years. So on the north side, land was given away fairly early on. So you can see Robert Ryan's name there. So that was the Lightfoot grant, 1794, as I mentioned at the very beginning, and that gets passed on to Campbell, and Campbell's the same Campbell of Campbell Cove on the south side. So that's where his house was. He never lived over there. Milson's name doesn't even appear on this map, but that Ryan, half of that Ryan estate was essentially Milson's. And then you've got William Blue, who's famously Billy Blue, and Billy Blue's Point there. That land grant is 1817. And then to the east, you've got Alfred Thrupp, 700 acres, which is all of present-day Neutral Bay over to North Cremorne. It's just an astonishing amount of land. It was in fact acquired by John Piper of Point Piper, who was the richest man in the harbour. But I think he got it as a land grant, had a word in someone's ear, and got that to give to his son-in-law, who was Alfred Thrupp, married to his daughter. And Thrupp and Piper's daughter promptly moved to Tasmania, so never lived there. But the name continued to be used on maps. So you will see constant references to the Thrupp estate, when Thrupp in fact never lived there, or indeed Thrupp's farm. And I'll show you Thrupp's cottage in a moment. And there's a Thrupp Street still in Neutral Bay, but as I said, Thrupp never lived there. John Piper went bankrupt in 1827, and the whole lot passed over to Solomon Levy and his partner, Cooper, first name having trouble with, possibly John. Cooper gave it to his nephew, who definitely was John Cooper. And so all of Neutral Bay was essentially in one man's hands. Now, on the west side, you'll see the name Wollstonecraft, and hence the name of the suburb Wollstonecraft. There's 524 acres given over to Edward Wollstonecraft in 1819. One of the significances of these large parcels of land, just literally owned by one person, is that they stay unalienated for a long time. That means they're just big parcels of land with one or two houses on them. And that will influence the way that, influence the design of the buildings that are built on there. It rather depends when those estates are subdivided. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, that street pattern, which you can see there, Thomas Florence was an early surveyor, was not realised, but it's quite a sensible one because it follows the topography of the landscape. You can see the ridges there, and the roads are running along the top of the ridges. The one thing that does ring true is the road going down from Blues Point up there, and that's present day Blues Point Road, and that was the earliest gazetted road in North Sydney in 1838, so 10 years after this plan was drawn up. And here's one of the first houses. So this is Edward Wollstonecraft's house, Crow's Nest Cottage. 1821, thereabouts it was built. Looking a lot like Don Bank Cottage, if anyone's been to our museum down in Napier Street. The site of that, it's not evident from this photograph because there's still so much timber there, even in 1904 when the photograph was taken, is the corner of Nicholson Street and Shirley Road, where the Presbyterian Church is, because this property was given to the Presbyterian Church, who promptly knocked down the cottage and built a church, which was there by 1906. So here's his verandahed farmhouse. He took himself away, Edward Wollstonecraft. He was a magistrate and a merchant, a partner of Alexander Berry. And from what I understand, he didn't like other people very much at all, which must have been unpleasant if you're up before him in his role as a magistrate. But he had a huge amount of foreshore land there, having all of that waterfront that you saw on the earlier map. But he chose to live high up on the ridge to be away from the smelly city and the Oiks, who he didn't particularly like. But also because the soil up there is a little better too. And it turns out, or I read somewhere in the City Gazette, that he developed his own variety of nectarine. So he was interested in orchards too. So maybe that explains why he wanted a piece of land above rather than beside the water. Anyway, that's the style of that architecture is Regency. Sort of, it's a Regency cottage. So it means it's very symmetrical. The veranda around it means it's a bungalow, and it's derived from the type of architecture that the British developed in India, and bungalow comes from Bengal. So George Campbell may have been the first person to bring across that style when he built his house above Sydney Cove. And this becomes quintessentially the Australian farmhouse. You can see that quite clearly. One of the reasons that North Sydney, or what we call North Sydney today, 10 square kilometres, is slower to develop than the south side is it's much higher, and it's separated by the harbour from the town on the other side. And it really is much slower to develop. In the 1850s, there are fewer than 500 people between and including present-day Mossman and all the way across to Waverton. Conrad Martins, nonetheless, moves to a block of land that he's acquired, having married a local woman, having been Charles Darwin's artist, actually, on the Beagle, believe it or not. And his house Rockley Grange was in present-day Edward Street, and he used his time wandering around the North Shore and becoming familiar with the North Shore to draw the South Shore. One of the advantages of being up high is that you get a great view of the town as it's unfolding on the south side. And he was trying to eke out an existence as an artist in an economy that was transitioning from being a convict port to being a free port, you know, a commercial port in the 1830s. He arrived in 1835, and then through the depression of the 1840s. So creating prints and subjects that would be appealing to an art-buying public were the best way to do that. I'm not entirely sure what that house is down there when we're looking down Blues Point Road here. And I thought it was Billy Blue's villa. And if this is 1842, there wouldn't have been any other house other than Billy Blue's villa there. But I'm also quite sure that Billy Blue's villa was just over the rise there. So it had a direct southerly view to the town on the other side. And that's been confirmed by that recent dig down at Blues Point with the metro tunnel going in. Casey and Lowe did a really, really, really good study of that area there. So whether it's Conrad Martin's being a bit fast and loose and applying artistic license and putting Billy Blue's house where we can see it for artistic effect, I'm not sure, but it's a substantial house. And I don't think there was any other substantial house there in 1842. Blue died in 1836 and passed the land on to his many children, and Blues Point Road existed, as I indicated, from 1838. But it hadn't been, the land was only starting to be subdivided in the 1840s, and people weren't building substantial houses like that then. So the bit of water you can see just there is Lavender Bay then. So those few people, those few hundred people who were living on the north side from the 1820s, 30s, 40s, Wollstonecraft back up at present day Crow's Nest, most of them lived on the foreshore because all the business and the money was to be made on the south side, and you needed to get there as quickly as possible. There were no ferry services, with the exception of Blue's punt on demand at Blues Point, and his sons took that over after he died. But this is Thrupp's cottage. Now again, Alfred Thrupp, if it was built in 1826, he was in Tasmania, so he obviously wasn't living in it. But it survived amazingly into the 1890s, which I suspect is when this photograph was taken, and we're so lucky that it was. And you can see the rickety old jetty. So there would have been various structures like this along the North Shore and with their own private little wharves, because you needed to get yourself across to the south side and back again. If you're wealthy enough, someone would row you, otherwise you rowed yourself. And that large structure on the just left there, that was Ben Boyd's old warehouse from 1842. That was still there until the 1930s, believe it or not. His house, Craig Nathan, survived until then. And then it was demolished to build a customs depot, and there's still a customs and border force establishment there. And on the right, we have Hay Street, so that orientates you there. A very sort of modest, simple cottage that would have been made from local materials, so stone and timber. Most of the buildings up until the 1870s would have either been stones, locally quarried sandstone, or timber, because bricks en masse anyway are not available until the 1880s. Well, the big game changer is the establishment of regular ferry services, which we can date to the 1860s, and the Milson family were big on that. This is Blues Point, in fact, a little earlier than that, 1856. The ferries were chugging across and steam by this stage, although there would have been watermen who would have rowed you for a fee, much as you can get a harbour taxi today. But ferries were plying, but not regularly enough to build up the population until the 1860s. And from then, it was essentially from Alfred Street, what became Alfred Street. Now, the effect of the ferries is extraordinary. So let's say less than 600 people in the 1850s across that whole area, present-day Mossman across to Waverton. By 1890, the population has ballooned to 17,000. So that's really astonishing, really astonishing. And then by 1914, it's 40,000. So it just keeps climbing. It's really, really amazing. Now, in order to manage all that growth, you've got the arrival of local government. And although I've called it a municipality of St Leonard's there, it's officially called the Borough of St Leonard's. And there were three. So East St Leonard's, sorry, was the first one, 1860. And you can see the borders of that there, divided up into wards, much as North Sydney is divided into wards today. Now, this map is printed in 1888, so those roads wouldn't have been there necessarily in 1860, but there were roads being built, and roads were one of the responsibilities of local government. And then the next one is St Leonard's, which is the largest of all the boroughs, and that included present-day Mossman. So you've got Mossman's ward spelt there with two S's, and going back, including present-day Camaray, all the way across to Willoughby. We've still got these rate and valuation books, believe it or not, in our collection, in the room next to me where I'm sitting, going back to 1867, and that's our bread and butter go-to archive for finding out the history of the built environment. When people come in and try and find the history of a building, we can look it up with our own resources back to 1867. And you can see it curls around there to include what was still the Berry estate in large part, all the way down to Balls Head and Berries Bay and Berry Island. And then there's tiny little Victoria, named after the Queen, which was just Blues Point and little more, sort of a bit of foreshore there at Lavender Bay. It was hardly viable, created in 1871, and all three boroughs came together in 1890 to create North Sydney, as we understand. And one of the main reasons was Victoria just was not economically sustainable when you're building all those roads and looking after the foreshore. So that's what we're still missing a bit of the east there, but that's the new Council of North Sydney area, essentially. In this map, this is one of my favourite maps. It's such a useful map. 1887, but as I said, in 1890, North Sydney is formed. Look how much of that original Wollstonecraft estate, which is now owned by, which passed on to Alexander Berry and then passed on to his descendants, the Hayes. Look how much of that still survives in pink as unalienated land, vast tracts of land there with no houses on them. He held on to his land, Alexander this is, fairly jealously. He was interested in developing some of the foreshore, but not subdividing a lot of that land. And it doesn't really happen until the 1890s. You can see a little bit of subdivision there, and you might recognise some of the names of the roads, but all that pink is essentially forest. Probably a little bit degraded because of the fire getters and whatever, but still lots of trees there. And it's not until the 1890s that the first really serious subdivisions of that big Wollstonecraft estate are established, and as a result you have to build a train station, and Waverton train station, there called Bay Road, still survives in its original form for the most part. So that's wonderful. Here's one of the subdivision maps from the Berry estate, and you can see the train line curling around there, just a single track. So one train goes one way and then has to reverse and go around the other way. You can still see Sinclair Street, Morton Street. This is so this is the Sydney property market in overdrive from the 1890s, and the Berry estate being sold off. That area essentially being marketed at very solid middle and even upper middle class people. These are substantial blocks of land that have been sold off. And these are the houses that are being built on them. Illaroo survives in Shirley Road, where not much else survives from this period, because it was ripe for the picking by developers in the 1960s. Such large blocks of land means you only have to buy two houses and you can put up a block of flats, and a serious block of flats at that. So a lot of these houses were knocked down in the 1960s. But Illaroo, which is one of my favourites, 1911, designed by Donald Esplin. Donald Esplin was born in Hay, and he never went to Britain, but you could go to a garden suburb in England and see a house that looked identical to that, with a big sloping roof that was meant to let all the snow fall off. And it doesn't snow much in Wollstonecraft, but such was the English aesthetic that influenced Australian architecture at a time that we generally refer to as Federation era for architecture. I've come to using the term English Revival because it's just so English, rough cast upper level. The one thing that really identifies it as Sydney in Australia is the sandstone and the incorporation of sandstone, which you can see there in Illaroo. These are rough ashlar blocks, so they've been cut by a stonemason and expertly cut, but intentionally meant to look rough. It's such a wonderful mix of materials. You've got beautiful brick. You've probably got some coloured glass in there, certainly leaded glass. You've got a rough cast upper level. You've got wall hung timber shingles on the gable on the right side as we're looking at it. Tiles, these ones look terracotta, but slate was used at the time. And then you've got stone, and it's so interesting. The aesthetic is straight out of the arts and crafts movement, which is emphasising the honesty and the beauty of handmade materials. And there's the architect himself with his family. Donald Esplin designed a lot of houses in North Sydney, and obviously because he lived here. Here's another plan from our collection. We have almost all the building applications from 1909, goodness, all the way through to 1930. And some of the earliest ones are the most beautiful. Very rare to see architectural plans survive from this period, because I suspect before 1929, they were taken back by the architect. And you would just have what's called a block plan, which is what you're seeing, and which has survived in our archive. But from 1929, council kept the architectural plans. So we have a really super collection of original plans from 29 to 49. After that, unfortunately, they were microfilmed and the originals destroyed for space reasons. But anyway, so there's the hand-coloured block there. You can see how large these blocks were. And here's another one even bigger. This house designed by Jocelyn and Vernon, but it's got a tennis court on the back. So as I was saying earlier, it only takes two of these and you've got a lot of land and you can put up a whopping great block of flats. And that explains why that area around Waverton and Wollstonecraft is, medium and high density today. That's essentially what the houses look like. These are, I've used the term English Revival. With that stripy gable, it's referred to as a half-timbered gable, and it's straight out of medieval England. I mean, it's probably obvious, and it is. That's the aesthetic. That's what they were doing. It's English Revival because in the late 19th century, there was a group of English architects, some of who came to Australia, Walter Liberty Vernon, Edward Jefferson Jackson among them, who were looking to historical English architecture and reinventing it, hence the term revival. And they introduced that to Australia, and that influences our Federation style architecture. This might be termed a Californian bungalow by some people because it's quite horizontal, but again, you can see that half timbered gable there. These are hand-coloured architectural plans in our collection. We're so lucky to have them. A lot of councils haven't kept theirs. And there's an actual photograph of Shirley Road. This part of Shirley Road heading down to Berry Island is still a showcase for this style of architecture. So that wasn't affected by the development of blocks of flats. Interesting for a fairly affluent area. These are big houses. They would have had servants, if not living in, sort of rolling up every morning. The roads are still unsealed, if you notice that, and the kids wandering around without shoes on. And that forest is well and truly given away to subdivisions. But look also in the foreground and you see street plantings, and there are two trees with guards around them. Joseph Henry Maiden, who was the director of the Botanic Gardens, from 1896 to 1920 something perhaps, was very, very keen on native trees. In fact, he was one of the prime movers in establishing Wattle Day, and very keen on greening suburbs. So he made various suggestions for ideal tree types, most of which were natives, to, and provided the tube stock for local councils to plant along the streets. Here's Crow's Nest House. So this is Alexander Berry's seat, if you like, on that huge estate that you saw in pink on the earlier maps. This is a little different by the 1900. He died in 1873, and this photograph's 1910 or thereabouts. So it's looking a little different. It's been modified, but a whopping great house there. Essentially the site of the Dem School beside the Pacific Highway today, and that was demolished in 1932, sitting on where Bay Road is today. And you can see the houses that were built there, sort of interwar, large interwar houses, literally dating from basically the year after they demolished Crow's Nest House. So these vast estates, the Wollstonecraft Berry estate in the west, and what was called the Thrupp estate, but is really owned by John Cooper in the second half of the 19th century, all around Neutral Bay. These are being cut up in the late 19th century and through the early 20th century and subdivided pretty well all at once. And that influences the style of architecture, which is why you have these pockets in North Sydney generally, particularly in Neutral Bay and over at Wollstonecraft, of particular types of architecture. And there's lots and lots around the turn of the 20th century. So Neutral Bay, like Wollstonecraft, areas of Wollstonecraft that have survived, are showcases for that, what I've called arts and crafts and English revival / Federation architecture. So here's Crow's Nest House that you've just seen a photograph, sitting there. Gradually the estate is just being whittled away, and it's got its big garden, and then it gets demolished, and that area gets turned into a school, essentially, except where Crow's Nest House is, there's Bay Road, as I said. But all below that, south of that, is the Dem School. And the more people that are living in an area, so 40,000 are living in North Sydney by the time this photograph is taken and this school is open, and that's the original North Sydney Girls High. Look at the architecture again, look at the gables. Oh, look, half timbered gables. So that aesthetic, that arts and crafts, English revival aesthetic, kicks on into public architecture. No coincidence, because Walter Liberty Vernon, who was one of the architects to bring it over in the 19th century from Britain as an immigrant, becomes the government architect in 1890. So as a result, a lot of public buildings in Sydney around that time, fire stations and the Neutral Bay Post Office in Yeo Street, represent his preferred style of architecture. He probably didn't design this school, but those who were working in the office would have been influenced by him and the general aesthetic at the time, and there it is. So that building is still standing today, which is beautiful. Okay, so we need infrastructure and we need roads, and council is responsible for those. You can see a switchback road there. You can see it's unsealed. You can see a lot of stone on a retaining wall and some really well cut stone blocks there. Now they still survive all around North Sydney, the walls that are holding up roads. I wander up and down Bent Street to get to and from the my all-day parking across Forsyth Park, and there are plenty of those stone walls. It's what makes North Sydney so interesting, or one of the reasons it's so interesting in my mind is looking at all the uses of stone. And you can see on the right-hand side still some original stone outcrops, uncut, but then beside them yet another rock retained wall. So that's called a coursed rough ashlar wall. Coursed because the blocks are all in a line, much as you lay bricks, but clearly the blocks are rough, and that's intentional. It's an aesthetic. And it also saves time, so you're not faced with having to smooth it down. And we have much of that surviving in North Sydney today. And it fits exactly with the aesthetic of the buildings that are being built at the time. And you can see in this photograph, it wouldn't surprise me if the bases of those bungalows above are of similar types of stone. Well, North Sydney is really filling up, more than 40,000 by the 1920s. And not everyone thinks it's a good thing. John D. Moore was both an artist, an architect, and a town planner. And this is a painting he did looking across Neutral Bay, essentially. You can see a mix of houses there, a half-timbered gable in the foreground. So that suggests that's an early 20th century bungalow. But there are other buildings there that look like Victorian terraces, one in the mid-foreground. And that big structure on the mid-left is the gas tank at above Neutral Bay, the North Shore Gas Company, built in the 1880s. No longer in use at this time, I think, 1920s, because they'd moved around to Oyster Bay by that stage. But clearly with the title Chaos, John D. Moore is looking at this and thinking this is less than desirable. He would rather a planned town, a planned suburb. And town planning had kicked off in Sydney big time from the turn of the century. The Town Planning Association was formed in 1914, and he was a member of that. But I've got to say, even for those estates like the Wollstonecraft estate, Berry estate, there's not a lot of evidence of actual planning. It seems to follow the topography of the land, which is not a bad thing, but the streets are higgledy-piggledy. You would have seen from those maps earlier on, I didn't point it out, I'm afraid, but the grid that is still there in the present day CBD, so Miller Street, Walker Street, Berry Street, Ridge Street, they sit around a grid that just defiantly charges up the hill regardless of the topography. At least what's been built in Wollstonecraft and Neutral Bay follows the topography, which is not a bad thing, which again explains why the streets are a bit higgledy-piggledy. Well, one of the big game changers, the first one was the establishment of ferries. The other one is the building of the Harbour Bridge, of course. So that the harbour doesn't become quite irrelevant, but it means that it's much easier to get from one side to the other. Look at that great big sawtooth workshop. That was where the steel was fabricated and lifted up. So this is it shortly before it all kicks off. And all the buildings on the east side of Alfred Street, which you can see there, had been demolished by this stage, well and truly demolished. Alfred Street was a very vibrant, densely settled street, and everything on the east side was just knocked down. And that has obviously become Bradfield Park. One thing leads to another, and often it is not planned. So that workshop that you saw in the previous photograph becomes the Olympic pool, because once the workshop is taken away, what do you do with that land? Council stuck its hand up and was given the opportunity to develop a state-of-the-art swimming pool just in time for the 1938 Empire Games. And we've still got the Olympic pool today. It's been upgraded, but that beautiful entrance vestibule is there. The grandstand that you can see here is in the, well, it's well and truly gone by now, but it will be replaced. That was filtered water at a time when most people were used to swimming around in the harbour and bumping into dead dogs and seagulls and all the rest. So it was really an extraordinary achievement, and built and paid for by council. How about that? And of course, next to there is Luna Park, which was also part of that workshop land. So it's two foreshore developments that wouldn't have happened had not the bridge been developed and that land become available. Now, none of that was planned. It was all sort of happen chance. Well, the bridge is there as a train bridge and a tram bridge and a pedestrian bridge. And John Bradfield also had an inkling it would be a car bridge. And he, in fact, was talking about superhighways all the way up the northern beaches in the 1920s and 30s. They weren't built, but the Pacific Highway, so named after the bridge is completed, just gets chocked up with cars in the post-war years because car ownership goes through the roof. You can see also already in the archives, as I look through those building applications that I mentioned and the plans, the number of garages that are being built in North Sydney in the 1920s is quite astonishing. Again, in the more affluent areas where people could afford cars. Well, more and more people can afford cars after the war, and the famous Holden is launched in 1949. There are probably a few FJs In this photograph here, I can see some. And that's what peak hour looks like in North Sydney in 1958, leading people to that obvious conclusion that when you've got more cars, you need to build more roads. And that's exactly what they decide to do, or not before tossing up some other solutions, like overpasses for pedestrians. Is one of those, at least in the over the Pacific Highway, joining one part of the CBD to the other. That was Keith Wright was the North Sydney Council town planner, and that's a sketch of an idea he articulated in a paper. Before I get on to the solution, there are the trams, and Sydney had the largest tram network in the Southern Hemisphere by the 1950s, and there they are. Look at all those overhead wires guiding the trams around and powering them, and that's all gone, but you can still see on some buildings the little connectors of those wires. But by the 1950s, and certainly by 1958, the last year of the trams, they're having difficulty getting through all the traffic. And which is it that gives way? Well, of course, it's trams, and cars take over. But you need to get, you need space to build an expressway. And what are you going to do? Well, you have to knock down all those houses. This is a view from St Leonard's Park. And we're essentially looking over the present-day Warringah Expressway. Look how many houses are there. 600 and something houses were knocked down. And if you can believe it, when you look at the population of North Sydney between 1950 and 1970, and the expressway was built in the 1960s, the population actually goes down. And that's also a time when flats are being built. So you would have thought the population would be going up because people are living in the air in these blocks of flats. But such is the loss of population because of the building of this expressway that, yeah, North Sydney, it's down by about, I can't actually remember the figure, but several thousand. So look at that. Look at that. That's the future. And that photograph was taken as a U-Butte photograph. You know, this is wonderful. This is Sydney functioning. Look at those clear roads, no congestion here. It's worked. And for some people, that was a realization of a dream, because the quaint little town on the other side of the harbour that was North Sydney, with Junction Street and Miller Street and little haberdashers and all the rest of it, had finally become the twin city, the CBD on the north side. And most of those buildings there, you can see the MLC building there tucked behind. I should have pointed it out earlier with that David Moore photograph. That's the first of them, biggest office block in Australia when it was completed in 58, soon pipped by the AMP building on the south side. But it's almost being dwarfed by everything else that's popped up in the decade or so afterwards. And that just divides the municipality. It's an extraordinary thing to behold. This photograph taken from the Greenway building, or one of them. Well, let's look at foreshores a little bit. So I mentioned the gas company with that great gas tank with the John D. Moore painting of Neutral Bay. Here's where they decamp to in Oyster Cove, which is at the bottom of Waverton and Wollstonecraft there. This becomes Wandakia, of course, and coal is turned into gas in these big complexes, and gas is used to light houses, and then it's used to power stoves and things. So that's the purpose of gasworks. The western side of the harbour, and North Sydney has quite a lot of western foreshore, everything west of the bridge essentially, or west of Neutral Bay, is mainly the industrial side of the harbour. So North Sydney has a lot of industrial sites on its foreshore, and this is one of the main ones too, on what was the Berry estate on the western side of Ball's Head. Berry would have loved to have seen this built in his time, but it postdates that considerably. The lease is signed in 1916, and there it is on its way to completion around about 1918. And we of course still have the coal loader there. And this is such a brilliant photograph because it shows you how it was made. All that rock fill, the quality of the rock wasn't good enough to sustain the tunnels in their own right, but it was used, and that stone was quarried on site to create the facing ashlar blocks and then all that rubble within. So really pays a walk through the tunnel, which is open 24/7, to see what was built down there. That's essentially what Ball's Head looked like before the coal loader was built. That's how it survived into the 20th century. Henry Lawson, who was a resident off and on of North Sydney from 1900 through to 1920 or thereabouts, and wrote really, really wonderful poems and stories of the area that have no equivalent in any other suburb that I'm aware of. So they're really special, and we're really lucky. He was absolutely apoplectic when the lease for the coal loader was signed in 1916, because he could see what was coming, and that this bushland, which he referred to in a poem called The Sacrifice of Ball's Head, was the last bit of bushland that the harbour people know. And by harbour people, he meant the working people of Sydney Harbour, the shipwrights and ferrymen and all the rest. This would all go. And he was right. Not that it was cleared specifically to build the coal loader, but one thing leads to another. And when you set up an industrial site, it's on for young and old, and people start pinching timber and all sorts of things. So Ball's Head was essentially completely denuded of trees by 1930. That's an idea of the forest that had survived. And that's what that area, that peninsula, looked like by the 1970s. There's Ball's Head on the top side of the peninsula there, with its big long wharf. You can see a pile of coal there and a single grab sliding crane. And on the south side, that's the BP terminal in Berries Bay. The origins of that go back to the 1920s, when it was Anglo-Persian, I think, and then Commonwealth Oil Refinery, and then it's BP. And the leases have finally come up, the 99-year leases for those come up for renewal and are not renewed in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. And so those parcels of land get turned over, thanks to the Carr government, to North Sydney. So the BP site that you can see there with all those tanks gets turned into Carradar Park, and the coal loader is that magnificent public amenity on the south side. Well, what's happening in the east side of the harbour, where it's more residential? So that previously was the west side. Lots of those large houses that were built to take advantage of views in the late 19th, early 20th century are being knocked down for blocks of flats that I've mentioned before. There is a big building site in the foreground there, a large house called Malahide, which I'm pretty sure was owned by a grazier. That was his Sydney digs. And, you know, as I indicated with Wollstonecraft, you know, it only takes one or two of these large houses with tennis courts and gardens to make way for a block of flats. So there's Malahide in the foreground. The largest of the block of flats you can see there is Quarterdeck, designed by Aaron Bolo, who was I think a Czechoslovakian or Hungarian architect, came out in 1911. And it's a really confrontingly ugly block of flats. I've got to say, I've tried to like it, but I just can't. And I especially don't like it because it replaced that house there, which is Meandetta, which was the home of Edmund Barton in the lead up to Federation. So it's as close as we have to Washington's home, Mount Vernon. Goodness me. And that was knocked down in 1963 without a peep. No one, I've not found any reference to any protest at that in any paper, and it is just shocking. And yeah, there we are. I'm not even sure whether the building next to it survived. Possibly it did. There are some nice buildings there in Carabella Street. However, wouldn't it be good if Meandetta was still there and we, you know, had a Museum of Federation in there or some such thing? Well, that time, 63, in the late 50s, was a time of slowly growing heritage consciousness. And here we have Bell's Terrace at Blues Point and Bellevue, which was built in the 1870s. A barn, the architect will come to me, famous church architects. And that was knocked down in 1958. Well, the loss of particularly Bellevue was the catalyst for the establishment of the North Shore Historical Society. I mean, they protested. They weren't lying down in front of bulldozers or anything. Those days had yet to come, but it was enough to prompt them to get together and protest and try and work out a solution. And the solution was to dismantle Bellevue stone by stone, believe it or not, and rebuild it elsewhere. And that was going to happen, and it was dismantled. Lend-Lease agreed to do that, and then the stones disappeared and no one knows where they went. And I have a terrible feeling they're either in a rock retaining wall or lining some footpath somewhere on the south side.
Well, Bell's Terrace and Bellevue were replaced by Blues Point Tower, which was designed by Harry Seidler. He'd only been in Australia for a decade or so. And this was part of a planned larger redevelopment, possibly the first sort of major master planning scheme imagined in Sydney, where existing buildings were to be demolished and just replaced with high-rise. Plans like this were realised elsewhere, but not here at McMahon's Point, because the only land that was resumed or bought for the purpose was down on the point. You can see how ambitious it was. Seidler and others were approached by the local Progress Association to come up with a residential scheme for the area, because it was mixed use, and there was plans for a cement works, believe it or not, down at Berries Bay, and they wanted to offset that. So it was regarded widely as a good idea at the time, but questioned afterwards.
Well, in the 1960s, so that didn't happen. It was 1957, 58, that scheme. And Blues Point Tower was the only one that went up. They couldn't afford to buy all that land, resume it to create that. But in the 1960s and early 70s, there was a sort of fairly dramatic rise in heritage consciousness. The green bands are very famous in the 70s, and that stops the clear felling of the rocks on the south side. And although the North Shore Historical Society lost the fight over Bellevue, they were the ones who saw Donbank Cottage, which they realised was really, really old, and they thought it had gone back to the 1820s. It's possibly 1840s. But they urged council to consider acquiring that, knowing that the owner, Catherine White, was very old, and in fact she died in 1975, and the family might be willing to sell it. The family could have got a fortune for that site, which is down in Napier Street next to the CBD, and they didn't, because they realised that it was a really important property. The Heritage Act is passed in 1977. Council is sufficiently interested by that stage, and this is the era of the new council. Carol Baker is the mayor at this time. Ted Mack is on council. Robin Reid is there. There's a new spirit in North Sydney Council, and heritage is right up there. And they acquire that land, and it's just astonishing, and it's wonderful that they did, because it's now recognised as the oldest timber house on the North Shore. Well, in 1983, in 1981, I'm sorry, council commissions the first heritage study in any area in Sydney, and possibly New South Wales, and then follows it up with a more extensive study in 1993, which identifies heritage conservation areas, such as this one down at Union Street, Thomas Street, Bank Street area. And these properties are protected as a result. I should have the figure at the top of my head, and I think it's 1,300 buildings were listed in one swoop in 1993, were added as heritage items to the LEP, and they've formed the core of the LEP ever since. Well, council got the land from the Labor government at the coal loader in the 1990s, and then in 2011 opened the coal loader. And it's now one of the jewels in North Sydney's crown, a perfect example of how to adaptively reuse industrial land and industrial site. That wharf is not owned by council and sticks out into maritime land or water, but just this year that was state heritage listed, so that will be saved in some form. It's looking even worse than that now, but hopefully part or all that's left will be saved. So that's a good result. And there's the platform that was opened in 2019. Yeah, I think that's just a wonderful example of adaptive reuse. And to see setting suns in the west is so magic from Ball's Head. But, you know, there are all sorts of development pressures on council. I was just wandering up Auburn Street looking for different things and saw what was clearly an early 20th century property literally had just been bulldozed, and there was a huge grabber just digging out the natural sandstone, presumably to put an underground car park, because I think there's a block of flats going in there. North Sydney, like many other places, is under a lot of pressure, and the 2006 City of Cities strategy passed by the state government, which was a 25-year strategy. So I'm not quite sure, because there's also the Metropolis of 3 Cities strategy, which is 2018, but the 2006 strategy purportedly went to 2031. That said that Sydney had to find, Sydney, the broader city, 640,000 houses, and North Sydney had to provide 5,500, well, dwellings, I should say, rather than houses, so it includes flats as well, 5,500 of those, which is 220 a year. So there's a lot of pressure on councils like North Sydney to abide by state government plans. The Metropolis of 3 Cities, which was drafted or released rather in 2018, has North Sydney as the eastern harbour city. And the figure there is 725,000 dwellings by 2036. This is from 2016 or thereabouts. So I imagine North Sydney has to come up with more than 5,500, which puts a lot of pressure. And there's balance between heritage and providing places for people to live, let alone aged care and parks and all the rest. So these are the things that my colleagues in planning have to deal with, and I'm not at all envious of the job that confronts them. However, yeah, we all try the best we can to save those buildings that I think should be saved. And there's the MLC building there, was slated for demolition by the company that built it, in fact, the MLC company. And that was, I think, just this year listed by the Minister on the State Heritage Register for swings and balances. And and there's the Crow's Nest strategy as well, which includes the Sydney Metro, just thinking of what's next, you know, goodness. So the CBD will be transformed. It is in the process of transformation now with another building that we haven't even seen the beginning of yet, about to emerge over the metro station, in the heart of Sydney, and then up at Crow's Nest. So North Sydney is changing faster now than it ever has, and sort of watch that space. And that's it. I think it's just on the hour. I took a little longer. Now, you may have all sorts of questions, and because there are quite a few people out there, I think possibly up to 100 people, which is really brilliant, more than I could talk to in any auditorium here. So that's the wonders of Zoom and the silver lining of COVID, I suppose. You're very welcome to send comments and questions through to that email address that I've just put up, localhistory@northsydney.nsw.gov.au. And yeah, let me know what you think, or yeah, if you've got a question, as I said, I'll do my best to answer that. Upton Grange, you know, what a beautiful building, and it's still there, although it's joined to another building. But anyway, at least it's surviving. So I'd encourage you, when you're able, to go down to Edward Street and have a look at that. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ian. Farewell, everyone.
Yasmin,